Hello. So in this unit, we're talking about aerobic performance as it relates to the acute changes that we're going to experience during exercise. And in this segment, we will focus on slides 7 through 36 in your student version of the PowerPoint. Okay, so we ended in class talking about stroke volume and how stroke volume will increase sort of linearly as it is related to exercise intensity. So again, as intensity increases, stroke volume will also increase. Now, we talked about Treppe phenomenon. We talked about Frank-Starling mechanism. I talked about afterload induced autoregulation, but just to kind of review those two factors, so afterload induced autoregulation and the sympathetic activation, let's start with afterload induced autoregulation. So if here's my heart, sorry, not good at drawing with my mouse, and here's my aorta. Again, the left ventricle is here, and the afterload is going to be occurring up here in the aorta. And essentially, when we talk about afterload induced autoregulation, the left ventricle will automatically kind of need to produce more pressure than what is experienced in the aorta in order for us to be able to push the blood out of the heart. So if the pressure in the aorta is 120, the left ventricle will need to produce enough pressure to overcome that. So 121, let's say. Okay. If the pressure in the aorta is 140, then by default, the left ventricle needs to up its game, and the left ventricle will produce more pressure than that. So it'll be more like 141 or something along those lines. So that's a little bit about afterload induced autoregulation. We talk about the sympathetic nervous system. It has an inotropic effect. And inotropic means that it's going to affect the force of the contraction. And so, again, this isn't like totally understood very well in the research. However, we do know that the sympathetic nervous system, something with the epinephrine and norepinephrine, will have a positive effect on contractility. So it will individually kind of like yell at those cells and tell them to like increase their strength of contraction in order for that stroke volume to increase. Again, that's kind of all you need to know about that, because like I said, the mechanism for that isn't 100% understood. So as we said, cardiac output is the product of heart rate and stroke volume, and we know that cardiac output will increase linearly with the exercise intensity. At rest, cardiac output is equal to about 5 liters per minute, and during maximal exercise, it can be anywhere from 20 to 40 liters per minute. Okay, so a huge range in terms of what that maximal cardiac output is. And the reason for that, maximal cardiac output is a function of number one, body size, and number two, endurance training. Okay, so again, the more highly trained someone is from an endurance perspective, the greater their cardiac output. And again, those will generally be products of blood volume and stroke volume changes. And again, we'll talk more about the chronic effects of exercise in our next lecture. But again, those are the two factors that will determine what your max cardiac output is. So here you can kind of see the relationship between cardiac output and where blood flow is actually going. So as we kind of increase that cardiac output during exercise, notice that the majority of that blood is going to the muscle. And that makes sense. Interestingly, at rest, a lot of the blood is going to that renal system, so going to the kidneys so that we can filter through the blood, and also a good portion going to the liver and the brain as well. And notice that those values stay pretty steady. Really, the major changes that we see are within the blood going to the muscles. Notice that the skin might be impacted, again, especially if we're like under a severe environmental stressor as well. And then we'll even see a little bit of an increase in the coronary blood flow as well, which is blood flow to the heart muscle itself. Okay, so when we think about cardiac output, again, we can kind of understand this through something called the Fick method. And I guess the elements we need to understand when we think about cardiac output, how much blood is flowing out of the heart, or how much blood do we need to flow out of the heart. It's important for us to note that the cardiovascular system is a closed loop system. What does that mean? That means for the most part, things are staying inside the system. So we're not seeing a whole lot of change of things coming in versus things going out as it relates to volume. Okay, so we will see a small shift in volume, but for the most part, that's going to remain pretty steady. So two factors determine the output of the fluid from the pump in this closed loop. Number one is a change in concentration of the substance between the outflow and inflow ports of the pump. So again, what is within the substance that leaves the heart versus comes back to the heart, and the total quantity of the substance that's being taken up or given off by the fluid in a given period of time. Okay, so again, looking at how much change do we have in terms of total volume. Okay, so the way in which we can kind of understand this is understanding VO2 and AVO2 difference. So VO2 tells us how much oxygen we're using within a minute. Okay, so as our need for oxygen goes up, our cardiac output will also go up. Okay, and then the other factor is AVO2 difference. AVO2 difference is atrioventricular difference, and this tells us the difference in oxygen concentrations in the arteries versus in the veins. So basically what this tells us is how much oxygen is dropped off at the tissue level. Okay, so the more oxygen I drop off at the tissue level, so if I increase AVO2 difference, that would allow me to decrease cardiac output. Okay, or vice versa. If I decrease cardiac output, that tells me that I need to increase how much I'm dropping off at the tissue level. Okay, so that's the relationship between cardiac output and AVO2 difference as it relates to kind of maintaining a balance there. Okay. We talked about this in our kind of our summary, kind of one of those introductory slides, but thinking about distribution of blood and the effect this might have on exercise. Again, blood flow changes with the vessel's radius. So again, we're looking at, oops, I gotta figure out how to get my hand in front of the camera here. So small size versus large size. Okay, so again, with vasodilation, we're looking at a larger tube versus vasoconstriction, we're looking at a smaller tube. So changing that, the size of the vessel. Okay, so what are some factors that are going to play a role in this? We already talked about catecholamines such as epinephrine and norepinephrine. Those will bind to the alpha receptors and cause vasodilation to the skeletal muscle and vasoconstriction to the gut. Other factors that are important from a local perspective, we have nitric oxide as well, and nitric oxide is going to be an important vasodilator. So basically, we're going to have more nitric oxide at the muscle level where we're activating muscle. So like if I'm biking, for example, I'm going to have a lot of nitric oxide kind of produced as a byproduct in my leg muscles. So therefore, the more nitric oxide that I have, the more vasodilation I'll have in those specific muscles. So again, when we think about the difference here between the catecholamines and nitric oxide is a local factor that would allow us to determine which muscles to send the blood to, versus the catecholamines of norepinephrine and epinephrine are going to have more of an all-encompassing effect on muscle tissue in general. Okay, so again, nitric oxide will facilitate blood vessel dilation and hence decrease vascular resistance. So again, the bigger the tube, the less resistance I need to overcome in order for blood to flow through the tube. Again, as we mentioned, kidneys and splanchnic regions, so the gut area, so like your digestive organs and those types of things, we're going to see a decrease in blood flow to these areas because of that vasoconstriction caused by the catecholamines, and because I only have a limited amount of blood. So I want to send more to the muscles. So these local factors and these vasodilation factors leading to the muscle is going to allow us to push blood kind of in that direction. So this is nice. This shows you the just another image that kind of shows you the difference in where we're sending our blood at rest versus during exercise. Again, at rest, good amount going to the gut, good amount going to the kidneys. Then we look at how that changes during exercise. Again, only 3 to 5% going to the gut here, and we're seeing 80 to 85% going to the muscles. As we mentioned, the skin might vary depending on the environmental stressor that you're experiencing during that exercise. Okay, this is fun. Let's talk about blood pressure, okay, and blood pressure responses during exercise. So again, we'll talk about this in more detail when we get to the anaerobic and the resistance training section of this class. So we'll come back to it then. So don't worry, I'm not just forgetting about those things. But let's take a look at some of these aerobic things in terms of what's going on here. So we're starting with steady state aerobic. So think of this as like a rhythmic, moderate intensity exercise. Okay, so think of like a nice jog or a nice bike or a nice elliptical, something like that. So oxygen need and oxygen demand are matched, and so like everything's good here. Okay, so what happens? We're going to have vasodilation to the active muscle, which is going to reduce TPR. TPR is total peripheral resistance. Okay, and so as I increase the size of the tube, I'm going to decrease total peripheral resistance, and this enhances blood flow to the periphery. Okay, as a result, I will see systolic blood pressure increase within the first few minutes and should level off at 140 to 160 millimeters of mercury. Okay, diastolic pressure will remain the same or maybe even slightly decrease. Okay, so takeaways, things you need to add to this section about steady state exercise. Systolic blood pressure will increase linearly until we reach 140 to 160, and then it'll level off there. And diastolic pressure will remain unchanged. Okay, moving down to graded. Graded exercise, again, we're looking at exercise that's incrementally getting harder. Okay, graded exercise, diastolic pressure still remains the same or maybe decreases. And then systolic blood pressure will increase in a stepwise manner until you reach about 200. Okay, this will be the same for well-trained and untrained individuals. Okay, so we'll both experience kind of this linear increase in systolic pressure until we get up to that 200 mark. Blood pressure in upper body exercise, this will produce a considerably higher change in systolic and diastolic pressure than doing leg exercises. And the reason for that is you have smaller arm muscles for the most part, unless you skip leg day a lot, in which case maybe you have more muscles in your upper body. But for normal people, you have less muscle mass in your upper extremity. So therefore, the vasculature offers greater resistance to blood flow than in your legs, because in your legs you have more muscle mass to kind of have that vasodilation. So as a result, the when you do like upper body exercise, we're going to have an exaggerated response, you could say, of the systolic pressure. Okay. And then lastly, I mentioned this in one of our classes, not in both sections though. In exercise recovery, we're going to experience something called an hypotensive response to exercise. And this hypotensive response basically is a decrease in blood pressure, sometimes lower than your resting levels, immediately during that exercise recovery phase. And basically what's going on is like, you know, you've vasodilated all these tubes. So again, the more muscle mass you have activated, the more hypotensive response you can have. So you got these tubes big and open, okay? And now when you stop exercise, your heart rate's going to go down pretty quick. Again, the more trained you are, the faster that heart rate will drop back down because that portion of the system recognizes almost right away that you're done with the exercise. I can't remember who I had in on the treadmill this morning, but their max heart rate was like 198, 199, whatever, when they did their VO2 max test. Within 1 minute, they were down to 160. So again, think of how fast we're able to drop that heart rate down once we stop exercise. Again, some of our most fit individuals might experience even more of a drop than that immediately following exercise. So as a result, think about this. I've got this huge tube. I had a bunch of blood flowing through it. Now I'm slowing down the amount of blood going through there. And so as a result, I've got a little trickle of blood flowing through a big tube. And that's going to result in a huge decrease in pressure immediately following exercise, resulting in a hypotensive response. So is this good? Is this bad? What should we do about it? For your average person, This is one of the reasons why it's important to gradually bring our heart rate down, so that we can kind of accommodate for this change. And then the other thing is, like, for people that are hypertensive, so people that have high blood pressure, this is a huge, huge, huge deal for them. So we can do aerobic exercise and allow them to have this hypotensive response for up to 12 hours after the exercise bout. So again, if you think about hypertension and the issues associated with that, okay, high blood pressure, this is constant pressure on your heart, right? It's constant tension that you need to overcome with your heart, okay? So to have 12 hours where your heart can kind of relax a little bit and breathe because of that hypotensive response, that's awesome. So again, a huge reason why kind of light aerobic exercise is really great for people that have hypertension, to kind of help with that. Excellent treatment option. Okay, so let's talk about blood. And we already talked about briefly in class that blood will be modified with exercise during that acute exercise. So we will see an immediate shift in blood volume. Let me see here, get my little marker up here. So plasma volume is going to shift out. So if here's my blood, okay, my blood vessel, essentially when we start exercising, we increase the pressure, we're going to have plasma volume shift out of the blood. I like doing these little drawings on here. Into the interstitial space, which is like out, it's just like no man's land in my opinion. It's just like outside of the blood, but it's not like in a cell or anything like that. So we'll see this plasma shift from inside the blood to this interstitial space because of this increase in pressure that's placed in this particular area. Okay, so that's cool. This will cause a reduction, 10 to 15% of blood volume during the onset of exercise, both endurance and resistance training, because we'll experience blood pressure changes in both. Okay, additional fluid loss can be also a factor to kind of keep in mind, because the other thing to note is, like, the fluid in your body is kind of able to float around these different areas pretty easily. So like interstitial space, fluid within the blood, intracellularly. So like fluid can move pretty easily from place to place. And so we might experience additional fluid loss, which could end up affecting the blood, based on if it's prolonged in duration. So again, if you have a high sweat rate and you're doing like a long exercise bout, but then also environmental conditions as well. Even if I'm not doing something hard, but it's like hot and humid, you're going to lose a lot of fluid that way, and that would certainly affect the blood volume. Okay, so how does hemoconcentration change during exercise? Okay, so we might see an increase of 20 to 25% of hemoconcentration during exercise. Okay, so what does that mean? Again, remember that the blood is made up of fluid and cells. Okay, so again, let's say I'm 50-50. Let's say I have 50 fluids and I have 50 blood cells. Okay, so we just said that we're going to lose 10 to 15% during this exercise. So now I have 40 fluids and 50 blood cells. Okay, so instead of being 50%, I'm more like 60% or 70 or 80 or whatever the math is on this. Okay, because now 50 out of 90, I'm actually going to do the math just to make sure I got this figured out for you. Yeah, so now you're at 55% for your hemoconcentration versus over here you were 50%. That doesn't mean we've increased blood cells. We just have less fluid to start with. Okay, so again, hemoconcentration will go up. This is a relative change. So again, the only reason this number has gone up is because you have less fluid to kind of dilute it, essentially. Okay, AVO2 difference was a factor that we mentioned previously. We're looking at the difference in oxygen concentration in the arteries versus the veins. And this is really important because it tells us how much oxygen we've dropped off at the tissue level. Okay. So at rest, this will actually surprise you, I think, a lot. So at rest, we're only using about 5 out of 20 mils. Okay, so if I had 20, again, these are all arbitrary numbers, but if I had 20 oxygen molecules in the arteries that are going to like the muscle or whatever, I'm going to drop off 5 of them. Okay, and that means that 15 are going to go back to the heart. Okay, so I'm only utilizing 25% of the oxygen that I'm carrying at rest. That's not very much, right? Like that seems kind of wasteful. We're only using 25% at rest. Okay, so what that tells us is that this deoxygenated blood still is 75% saturated in blood or in oxygen. So that's kind of like crazy to think about. Okay, now during exercise, we're going to increase this value. We're going to increase the amount of oxygen that we're able to drop off at the tissue level, which is what is shown here. Okay, so if I started with 20, this is also going to surprise you. How much do you think we're able to drop off? Well, seems like the best of the best in endurance athletes are going to drop off about 12. Maybe 13, meaning that my deoxygenated version is still 8. Okay, so what does this tell me? We suck at this. This is a limiter. This is a huge limiting factor for us as it relates to aerobic performance. We're not good at getting oxygen out of the blood and into the tissue. We're only a little over 50% effectiveness. Okay. This is a huge limiting factor. Okay. Us getting air into the lungs, no big deal. Us getting air from the lungs into the blood, also very good. 98%. We're very good at that. We're not good at dropping off the oxygen at the level of the tissue. This is a limiter for us in aerobic exercise. Okay. So what factors would affect the exercise AVO2 difference? Number one, increased oxygen utilization within the muscle causes an increase in oxygen extraction. So again, think about this as it relates to a pressure gradient. So if I start using a bunch inside the muscle, that's going to decrease the amount that I have in the muscle. So therefore, I'm going to move more from the blood into the muscle. Okay. An increase in capillary to fiber ratio reflects positive endurance training and enhances the AVO2 difference. Okay, so what does that mean? Basically, if I can create more capillaries, if I can create more blood vessels to lead to these muscle cells, there's less distance that oxygen needs to travel in order to move from the blood into the cell. So therefore, if I can decrease the diffusible distance, if I can minimize how much that oxygen molecule needs to travel in order to get used, then it's easier for me to drop more off. Okay. And then lastly, increasing the number and size of mitochondria improves the metabolism of oxygen and therefore enhancing our ability to use the oxygen that is dropped off. This is a factor that clearly differentiates endurance athletes from non-trained individuals. Like I said, a huge limiting factor for us in the world of endurance. Okay, so we talked about the cardiovascular changes that we experience during aerobic exercise. Now we're going to move forward and take a look at the pulmonary adaptations or the pulmonary changes during acute exercise. Okay, so let's talk about kind of just getting some of these terms down and then we'll go into the nitty-gritties. Okay, so tidal volume. What is tidal volume? Tidal volume is the amount of air that I bring into my lungs in any one given breath. Okay. Breathing frequency, how many breaths am I taking per minute? Average is about 12 breaths per minute. Okay, the bronchial tubes, what are they doing? The bronchial tubes are the tubes that come into the lungs and allow us to deliver that air, that oxygen to the terminal units of the lungs. Okay, so they're the tubes that are going to lead us down the path. And then we'll experience something called an enhanced VQ ratio, which has to do with the matching of, sorry, I'm looking to make sure I have this in my future slides. The matching of ventilation and cardiac output. So we're looking at the efficiency of matching the cardiovascular and the pulmonary units or the pulmonary systems in order to maximize efficiency. Okay, so let's talk about acute exercise. What happens? We need to increase ventilation. We can do this in two ways. We can increase breathing rate. We can also increase the depth of each breath. Okay, so we can increase breathing rate, which is kind of like increased heart rate, right? And we can increase breathing tidal volume, which is kind of like stroke volume, right? If you were to kind of compare the systems, that's kind of how we would compare them. Okay, so breathing rate and breathing depth, also known as tidal volume. Okay, during moderate intensity exercise, well-trained athletes tend to increase tidal volume greatly and increase breathing frequency very little. Okay, so the biggest change with moderate is an increase in tidal volume and a small change in breathing frequency. Okay. As exercise intensity continues to build, okay, we will have tidal volume level off because we'll kind of reach like your lungs can only hold so much, right? So again, once we kind of maximize tidal volume, then we'll continue to increase breathing frequency. Okay, so during high intensity exercise, we'll eventually have tidal volume level off, and then we'll experience a continued increase in breathing frequency. We can also do like conscious manipulation of breathing. This usually disturbs the regulated physiological adjustments to exercise. So again, it's hard for us to honestly to try and control our breath in many situations. Now, certainly there are sports and scenarios where this is really important. If I'm not consciously controlling what I'm doing when I swim, then I'm going to drink water, and that's not going to work really well. So again, there are definitely situations where we're thinking about what we're doing. Strength training is another example where we should really be thinking about when to breathe because that's an important component of that particular skill. There is a term for this called entrainment, and entrainment is a rhythmic oscillation of physiological factors such as breathing. So it's an interaction of circadian rhythms and the environment. So this is freaking cool. So we're able to kind of, sometimes you don't even know you're doing it, but like in running, for example, you could do like 2 breaths in, 3 breaths out with your stride. So again, kind of creating a rhythmic breathing pattern. Again, like I've had a lot of hurdlers that when their lead leg snaps down, that's when they breathe out. Like we said, during strength training, you probably don't think about it anymore. But again, hopefully you're breathing out during the harder phase of that exercise. Again, swimming is another great example where we use entrainment, kind of that rhythmic oscillation of breathing. Also a great way to kind of help monitor anxiety and nerves and things like that is focusing on breathing and kind of controlling those avenues. And that in turn will help you to kind of control some of the other aspects. Okay, control of ventilation. So again, how does this work? This slide's cool. We got a lot of stuff going on here. So let's take a look at what's going on to simulate or stimulate inspiration and also stimulate expiration. Okay, so let's go inspiration. Okay, so breathing, again, controlled by the nervous system. We've got multiple checks and balances to kind of keep things in line. Okay, so what are the checks, we should say, that will determine our inspiratory rate? Okay, so we kind of have like an intrinsic rate that's set by the medulla. So the medulla oblongata houses the respiratory center, and that'll kind of have its own kind of intrinsic rate. Now we're constantly receiving feedback from these 3 types of receptors, which will allow us to modify that rate. And those receptors include baroreceptors. So as we increase blood pressure, this would stimulate inspiration. Chemoreceptors are going to monitor changes in blood acidity. So of particular interest for us would be oxygen levels and CO2 levels, as well as hydrogen levels. Okay, so those hydrogen molecules and the CO2 molecules are going to be the greatest stimulant for an increase in inspiration. Okay. And then lastly, we have proprioceptors. And proprioceptors are responsible, again, they're found in the joints and the muscles, and they're responsible for detecting increased movement, changes in body position. So again, if I start kind of going through the motions, I'm getting ready to do a warm up, that would allow me to stimulate that inspiration or that inspiratory center. Okay. When that inspiratory center is activated, this will result in the activation of the phrenic nerve. The phrenic nerve will cause the contraction of the diaphragm, and the diaphragm, when it contracts, is going to flatten out and push down. And the external intercostals are going to pull the ribs out and up, creating a larger thoracic cavity, which allows air to rush in. Okay? So that's what's going on in the inspiratory side. Let's take a look at what's going on in the expiratory side. Now, generally, expiration is passive. Okay, so I'm going to bring air in and then I'm just going to return back to my resting position. But we do have some checks and balances, and there certainly are some scenarios where I want to breathe out forcefully. So we want to be able to do that, but that's not a normal part of just our everyday normal breathing. Okay, so we have stretch receptors that are going to prevent overinflation of the lungs. These aren't really going to be activated like normal, right? So again, these stretch receptors are only going to be activated if I'm really bringing in a ton of air, right? So we're not getting to the point where we're activating these stretch receptors on a normal day-to-day basis. Okay, but if they were to be activated, that would stimulate the expiratory center. The expiratory center is found in the medulla, and that will cause the activation of the intercostal nerve. The intercostal nerve will cause the abdominals to contract, and the contraction of your abdominals is going to create more pressure inside the thoracic cavity, and that's going to help us to produce more pressure here so that I have to get those gases out. The other muscle that we will activate is the internal intercostals, and they are going to pull the rib cage in and down. And that's going to allow us to, again, forcefully modify the size of the thoracic cavity. And as I decrease the size of the cavity, that's going to allow me to get that air out because I want to reach a pressure equilibrium of gas inside and gas outside. Okay. Other things that might happen, particularly during exercise, I'm going to experience some vasodilation in those bronchial tubes, and that'll be due to the activation of that sympathetic nervous system. So we got that going as well. So we can experience some variations in our normal breathing patterns during exercise. And again, we want these to progress in an effective and highly economical manner, but sometimes can adversely affect us in exercise performance. So we can experience hyperventilation, which can result in lightheadedness because we have I guess I don't want to say a negative change in pH, but pH, like our blood becomes too basic, and so that can cause us to be lightheaded. Dyspnea is shortness of breath or distress during breathing. This is usually seen in novice exercisers because when you're a novice exerciser, instead of breathing big and increasing that tidal volume that we talked about, they're doing like that, like short, shallow breaths. And so that's an issue because we're not utilizing all that mass that we have. So that's something that we see in novice exercisers. The Valsalva maneuver, we can do this during heavy lifting. Again, we'll talk more about this when we get to our strength training unit, but it's kind of that type of thing that you can do when you like poop, for example. But we also use it in strength training. You use it when you push out a baby as well. But that's a method that we can use to increase thoracic pressure in order to maintain like a stable body position, like when you're lifting heavy, stuff like that. Entrainment we already talked about, but that's like a rhythmic oscillation in breathing where you're kind of controlling your breath, and we can use that in multiple different settings. Okay, VQ ratio, I alluded to this. Now this I love. This is cool. So let's get a picture going. Okay, so here we'll say rest. Sorry, this is going to take me a while. This is submaximal. and this is maximal exercise. And we're looking at the efficiency of the cardiovascular and the pulmonary system in terms of being able to be matched. So let me get this drawn and then I'll explain it. How's that sound? Okay, Q is supposed to also be like linearly increasing. Sorry, I know it looks like not like that, but they're both supposed to linearly increase. Okay, so let's take a look at what this means. So VQ ratio, V, ventilation, Q, cardiac output. Okay, so at rest, your value is 0.8. Okay, so think 8 over 10. So 8 ventilations and 10 cardiac outputs. Okay, so cardiac output is greater than ventilation when we're at rest. Okay, but ratio is decent. Okay, is this okay? Like, are we okay to have this VQ ratio? So we do have some mismatching resulting in more cardiac output going to the muscle or going to the lungs than ventilation coming in. And the answer is yes, this is fine. The reason that this is fine is because you're not struggling to deliver oxygen, you're not struggling to get out waste products. All is good. Life is good. Okay. So then you can look at submaximal exercise. And at submaximal exercise, the VQ ratio is about 1.0. This is great. This is awesome. 1.0, greatest efficiency. I have 10 ventilations. I have 10 cardiac outputs. Life is good. Everything's matching up. Everybody's happy. Okay, so maximal efficiency of these matching occurs during submaximal exercise. Now notice that during maximal exercise, I could get that VQ ratio up to 5.0, okay, which tells me now I have like 50 ventilations and 10 cardiac outputs. So this is not good, right? This isn't good. This isn't good matching. What's going on here? Why is this happening? Okay, well, remember the differences between the cardiovascular and the pulmonary system, right? The pulmonary system, all your job is to bring air in and get it out. That's it. That's all you have to do, okay? The cardiovascular system has to do a shit ton of stuff. So there's a mismatch in terms of job titles, really. So ventilation, we can do that all day. We're good at that because that's all that system has to do. The cardiovascular system, however, when exercise occurs, now you got to deliver more blood to the brain, to the heart, to the muscles, to the skin so you can dissipate heat. And you've got to send some to the heart to fuel that heart muscle. And you have to send more to the lungs so that we can pick up more oxygen. So the cardiovascular system is our limiter here. Okay, so the ventilation, we're good. We're good at that. The limiting factor here is how much blood I can send to the lungs. Okay, and that's a huge limiting factor for us in maximal exercise because of all of the things we have to do with that cardiovascular system in order to kind of keep up with the exercise. So that's what's up with this. Now, we've talked about lactate threshold, and I want to kind of bring this all together to kind of show us the difference between lactate threshold, ventilatory threshold, and what's known as the anaerobic threshold. Okay, now, ventilatory threshold, lactate threshold is a black dot, and anaerobic threshold here. Notice that they all occur within the same zone. Okay. Now, what is the difference? What's going on here? Okay, so again, all three represent the interaction between aerobic and anaerobic metabolism. Now, how we measure them is different. Okay, lactate threshold. How do we measure this? Okay, we're going to take a finger prick. We're going to prick your finger and look to see what the lactate levels in your blood are as we move through this hard exercise bout. Okay, and we'll see those lactate levels spike once we get past that threshold point. Now notice that that is the same occurrence as the anaerobic threshold and the ventilatory threshold. Okay, ventilatory threshold we measure through the face mask. We can measure how much ventilation we're doing as we continue through that hard exercise bout. Okay, and notice that ventilation is going to increase substantially once we get to that threshold level. Now, the reason for that is because as I start to build up lactate, I'm also building up hydrogen, and now I want to breathe out those waste products. So that's what's going on with ventilation. So that's the relationship between the lactate threshold and the ventilatory threshold. Okay. It's all caused by the same thing. It's just a matter of which are we measuring? Are we measuring the change in ventilation? So are we breathing out more? Or are we measuring what's going on in your blood through a finger prick? Okay, so again, they represent the same time point in exercise, or the same time or the same intensity. However, the way in which we measure them varies. Okay. Now, anaerobic threshold is more theoretical in nature. So this shows us the interaction between aerobic and anaerobic work. However, like this is just like a term. It's more like a theory, right? So the way in which we measure it is ventilation or lactate, but that's the general broad term for it is anaerobic threshold. Okay. Metabolic changes, again, this should be a breeze because we've already talked about these, but so this should be a nice little review. Total metabolic rate during acute aerobic exercise will increase linearly with the intensity. So the harder you work, the more calories you burn. Okay. As exercise intensity increases, we rely more on carbs. And as we increase the duration of the exercise, we'll rely more on fuels, on lipids for fuel. How does RER change during acute exercise? We will see an increase in RER with intensity, but we'll see a decrease in RER with duration. Okay, so that increase in RER would tell us that we are relying more on fats, and the decrease in RER would tell us that we're using more. I'm sorry, did I say that backwards? If RER increases, that tells us we're using more carbs. If RER decreases, that tells us we're using more fats. Sorry, I think I got that switched there. This, again, nothing you haven't already seen. This just shows you the relationship between energy stores and time. So again, as I continue on, that aerobic system is going to take over after that 2-minute mark. Here you can see the lactic acid system, ATP stores, and then the ATP phosphocreatine getting us to 10 seconds. Here you can see kind of a longer duration type of exercise. So again, ATP, you got like 4 seconds. Creatine phosphate, 10 to 12 seconds. Glycogen can get you through like 2 hours or so. So you have enough glycogen available to last you like 2 hours. And then fats are going to take over from that point on to really be a substantial provider for us at that point. Here you can see the relationship between calories burned and heart rate. So again, heart rate's a great indicator of exercise intensity, which is why, like, if you've ever done the elliptical or something like that and you put your hands on and the sensor's there and it gets your heart rate, it'll like tell you how many calories an hour you're burning or how many calories you've burnt so far while on that piece of equipment. All that's kind of based off of this chart here. So again, pretty linear relationship between heart rate and calories burnt during aerobic exercise. Okay, what about the neural changes? So what's going on from a neural perspective as it relates to acute aerobic exercise? So you already know we're going to activate the sympathetic nervous system. So that's awesome. How does this affect the cardiovascular, pulmonary, metabolic, and muscular systems? Can you tie it all together? So again, we've talked about the impact of the nervous system on many of those systems. So again, make sure you're well aware of kind of that role with each of those. But also, let's take a look at what else is going on from a neural perspective. Okay, so do make sure you understand the sympathetic nervous system and the role that plays within all those other systems, like the cardiovascular, pulmonary, metabolic. Okay. Other things that we're going to do from a neural perspective, we're going to recruit and synchronize the use of our motor units. Okay, so again, during aerobic exercise, we're going to choose those slow twitch fibers. Okay, we're going to activate a motor plan from the cerebellum if we're doing something that's kind of like an automatic skill, like riding a bike, for example, or like swimming, something like that. I have a motor plan ready for that. I'll get it out of storage and be able to use that motor plan so that it's like an automatic activity. Cerebral cortex can certainly affect your psychological state during the exercise bout. It can also allow us to fine tune or modify the motor plan when we need to. So for example, if I'm swimming in a pool, that's really different than when I swim like in open water. If I'm swimming in open water, I might need to adjust for, like if it's windy and the water is choppy, okay, how am I going to adjust that plan in order to account for that? Or if the sun's in my eye and, I'm like swimming straight into a spot where you can't see very well. Okay, how do I adjust for that? So thinking about how we might fine tune that motor plan, even with a plan that's really automatic in nature. Okay, we can also talk about psychological like well-being during an acute exercise bout because of those feel-good hormones that we are or releasing, those endorphins that we're releasing. You're almost always in a better mood following an acute exercise bout than you were before. Okay, so again, there's tons of research kind of linking those factors as well in terms of mood state and how exercise can elevate your mood. Kind of pretty much, dare I say, any type of exercise would do that for you. So again, another nice sales pitch for why we should be active. Okay, what about acute muscular changes? So again, we're going to have selective activation or recruitment of appropriate motor units. We mentioned that on the previous slide. Again, a motor unit represents one motor neuron in all the muscle cells it innervates. Again, we would prefer those slow twitch type 1 fibers for aerobic exercise. We'll also have enhanced metabolism within the appropriate muscle fibers. So again, we're going to really get that glycolysis going, that Krebs cycle, the electron transport chain in those cells that are activated, those slow twitch cells. Okay, an increase in temperature at the level of the muscle is going to enhance contractile force, speed of contraction, and also clearance of waste products as well. So again, another sales for why we should do a good diligent warm up before we begin an exercise bout. We want to make sure that that temperature is up so that we're ready to kind of fire on all cylinders. Okay, from a hormonal perspective, again, we've already talked about epinephrine and norepinephrine. Okay, so again, those are kind of those adrenaline hormones that we talked about. They will have an all-encompassing effect on all sorts of stuff. So they're going to increase. ADH, cortisol, growth hormone will all increase. You know that insulin will decrease. Okay, so let's talk about some of these others. ADH, antidiuretic hormone. Okay, so the job of this is to like retain water. So it's an antidiuretic. Something that's a diuretic makes you pee. So an antidiuretic makes you not pee. Okay, so again, we're trying to slow down the amount of fluid that is like going through the kidneys and we're going to pee out because we want to hold on to that fluid so that we can sweat. Okay, so ADH is going to help us retain fluid so that we have it to sweat. So less peeing, more sweating. Okay. Cortisol, we know, is a stress hormone that will be released. That's going to assist us with the recovery process following that exercise bout. Same gig with growth hormone. That's going to help us with that recovery process, maybe more diurnal in nature as it relates to the release of growth hormone. However, it will assist us in recovery from the exercise, particularly when we sleep. Insulin's going to decrease because we know that insulin's job is to help us store sugars. We don't want to store sugars when we're doing exercise. We want to get sugars out of storage so that we can utilize them. So therefore, we need to decrease insulin appropriately. Okay, so we've talked a lot about these different factors and the different layers and the things going on during acute aerobic exercise. Now it's time for us to briefly talk about VO2 max. And again, you're going to tell me much more about this in your lab reports, but this will give you some good background information about VO2 max and what's going on here. Okay, so VO2 max, the maximum amount of oxygen that I can consume and utilize at any given time, or liters per minute is generally how we measure that. Okay, so this represents, again, the maximum amount of oxygen that anyone can utilize. Okay, but there's a lot of things going on here. This is super complex. So what do we need to do? What are all the elements that are important in terms of determining our VO2 max? Number one, I need to bring air into the lungs, and I'm going to bring it to the alveoli, which is the terminal unit of the lungs. Number two, I'm going to move that oxygen from the lungs into the blood. And that process is called external respiration, the movement of oxygen from in the alveoli to into the blood. Okay. Number three, I'm going to carry that oxygen in the blood to the level of the skeletal muscle where I want to use it. Number four, I'm going to do something called internal respiration. And internal respiration involves the movement of oxygen from in the blood to into the skeletal muscle. Okay. This represents AVO2 difference. We talked about that just a little bit ago. Okay, so movement of blood from movement of oxygen from in the blood to into the skeletal muscle. Okay, once I get that oxygen in the cell, I'm able to move it to the mitochondria as well, okay, within the cell through an element carrier called myoglobin. And once I get that oxygen into the mitochondria, I can use that oxygen as that final electron acceptor on the electron transport chain, allowing us to produce ATP through aerobic processes. So a lot is going on here, right? There's a ton happening within this process. So a lot to really think about when we think about what is limiting us, what is separating one athlete from another, one person from another in terms of VO2 max. Lots of things. So there's lots of areas or lots of spots where we could have an error occur or have kind of like a weak link, you could say. Okay, so how do we do this? How do we test or estimate VO2 max? So again, VO2 max is commonly tested via indirect calorimetry through the use of a metabolic cart. Okay, so again, that's what we're doing with our treadmill test. It's graded in nature. So again, it gets harder every 3 minutes and it's incremental. So every stage is 3 minutes with the exception of the first stage being 1 minute. Okay, so again, that's kind of the gold standard in terms of how to measure VO2 max. Again, all VO2 max tests, for the most part, if it's a true VO2 max test, are graded and incremental. They're going to start easy and get harder. Usually the increments are somewhere between 2 to 4 minutes. The protocol we're using is 3 minutes. This is so the body can reach a steady state before increasing the intensity. Okay, so again, the idea here is it maybe takes you 2 minutes to kind of adjust to that new intensity, and then you kind of bump up to the next one. So ideally, like when you change intensities on that treadmill, I like you to try to get a full minute in the next stage in order for it to really allow you to get the benefit. If you only make it 30 seconds, you don't get that full benefit of going at that next intensity. So if you haven't done your treadmill test, whatever your last stage is, try to make it at least a minute in order to really fully see the benefit of being at that intensity, in order for your body to adjust. If you can, do your best, right? Stress testing is kind of similar to VO2 max testing. Not always necessary to send a client to their full max. However, for these stress tests, they're usually in 1 minute increments. So again, we're going to increase the intensity every minute in duration. There's all sorts of different submaximal and maximal protocols to estimate VO2 max levels. Okay, so let's talk about some of those. Okay, VO2 max protocols. The Bruce treadmill protocol is probably I would say the gold standard for average population. I'm going to show you what that protocol looks like on the next slide. I prefer the McConnell treadmill protocol, which is what we're using in our lab. And I'll talk about why when you take a look at that here on the next slide. We can also do a cycle ergometer protocol. We have a student in this class who had a knee injury, so it's great to be able to have the option to be able to use a bike instead of a treadmill. However, it's really common that we see when using a bike, VO2 max levels will be about 10% lower than what they would be if that person were able to do it on a treadmill. Unless that person is an elite cyclist, in which case an elite cyclist or even a triathlete, I would say, at the elite level would be pretty darn close to what they could do on the treadmill. For myself, I'm about 5% different, I would say. Cycle is about 5% lower than what I could do on the treadmill. So again, it can vary from person to person. The reason for that is it's harder to truly maximize your all your muscle mass when you're cycling versus running. You can do that a little bit easier because it's a weight bearing activity. Okay, let's take a look at the differences here. Notice that with McConnell, again, this is what we're doing in our lab. They're starting at 4 miles per hour, then you're immediately at 5 miles per hour, which most of you think is like an awkward pace because you're not quite running. It's like a really slow jog or a very brisk walk. It's like a weird pace. Then you get to 6 miles per hour and you're running. Okay, 7, 8, 9 miles per hour you're running. And then if we were to make it past this 4% grade, then you go up to 6% grade, etc. Okay, so that's what McConnell looks like. The reason that this isn't the gold standard, there's tons of people that can't make it through stage 2. So then I haven't allowed this person to even go past 4 minutes in duration. That's not a really great indication for that person, like what their true VO2 max is, because the test was too hard up front. Okay, which is why Bruce is kind of the more common way to do it. I should actually make you guys do both. Actually, I should make the non-athletes or the fall sport athletes do the Bruce, because this one isn't like, I don't know, it's kind of weird. So you're going to start at 1.7 miles per hour, which is very slow walk, but 10% grade. Like this is a good amount of grade. And then you're going to increase to 2.5 miles per hour with a 12% grade, 3.4, 14% grade. So again, you can walk up until 9 minutes. Pretty, I don't want to say easily, but like easily. There's also a modified Bruce for people that aren't even fit enough to do this. Again, I think I will. I think I should have you guys try this just to get a feel for what this is like. You won't get a good VO2 max estimate because this is awkward. Like you never, as athletes, like we don't go at 18 to 20 to 22% grade. Like this is like a really steep hill and it's like super awkward. And I've done it before and I don't feel comfortable going at this high grade and trying to run. Like it's just kind of super awkward to do that. But again, you know, like I said, this is probably the gold standard for the average population. Now, this would probably give our class a better true look at what their VO2 max is, just because we are an athletic population. So that's why I chose this. But again, just nice to see the differences between these two. You know, best case scenario, if you're working in a exercise phys lab or something like that, it's good to know all of these different things so that you can cater this towards the person that you're working with so that you can make the best choice for their particular background. The cycle ergometer test, I didn't really talk much about that, but again, there's like a YMCA cycling test. I can't remember if I talk about that in this lecture or not, but it's basically every 3 minutes the wattage increases. And so again, it's just an incremental test in nature where we set the cadence for the person. So like how fast their feet are moving, they have to kind of keep that constant. And then we monitor their wattage or like how hard it is to press on those pedals until they can't keep the cadence going. So that's one way to do that. But there's lots of different protocols out there for the cycling. And basically you just got to make it harder every 3 minutes. So, okay. How do you know if you've reached your true VO2 max? There are 4 different criteria. If this were a publishable piece of research, you want to hit 3 of the 4 of these criteria in order to be considered a VO2 max. Now, if you have a subject that doesn't reach a VO2 max, does that mean we kick them out of the study? Because again, usually somebody will reach RPE of 10, which is as hard as I can go, maybe before I reach some of these other factors. So again, that one is almost always met. So some researchers will choose to use, instead of the word VO2 max, they'll use VO2 peak. And VO2 peak just kind of accounts for the possibility that they didn't meet all of these criteria, but it was the highest peak they could get to, the highest peak your subjects could get to. So that's another option. If you see VO2 peak in the research versus VO2 max, that's the reason why you see that. So some researchers prefer that term. Now let's take a look at what we need to do to get a true max. We need a plateau in VO2 despite an increase in workload. Okay, so again, I like to have subjects get it 1 minute into that final stage in order for us to truly know that their VO2 max has, or their VO2 has plateaued. Number two, we reached 95% of age predicted max, which is why on those sheets that you're filling out when you go do the treadmill, it asks you for, I think I can't remember if I have 85% or 95% on there so that you kind of have an idea of when they're going to reach their max or how close they are. RER greater than 1.1, and then an RPE of 10. So again, we can kind of look at all of those and kind of determine if that subject met 3 of those 4 criteria, and that would allow us to know.